Hey, good afternoon. We'll get started. It's really awkward to be up here and everybody be so far away, so closer, better? Okay. So before we get started on the talk about government using open source, Camden and myself wanted to introduce ourselves and talk about our background a little bit so you understand our perspective. So I'm Austen Bryan. Nice to meet the half of you that don't work at the same company as me. I was 12 years active duty Air Force. In that role, helped build, buy, acquire, integrate, test, operate a whole bunch of different software systems for mission critical things. On my last couple steps of that journey though, I helped start a couple software organizations in the Department of the Air Force. The first one being Level Up Codeworks, which has successfully been killed as a program. That was not my fault, but it's gone now. And then the second one was Platform One, some people have heard of if you live in the defense space. Was fortunate enough to meet a group of people that kind of started that program, enterprise DevOps platform for other programs to use to ship software more efficiently, which is where I got introduced to a lot of these communities and people, which has been awesome. And then 2.5 years ago, I left active duty service, and now I work at a company called Defense Unicorns. We build open source software to help deliver software into DoD environments, all sorts of interesting places. Happy to share some of those stories at a later time. I'll turn it over to Camden.
Thanks. So my name is Camden. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. I'm still active duty. So I spent the first close to 10 years of my career doing nothing but going to school. And then the Air Force decided that I needed to get serious and actually do something for them. Luckily, around that same time, I met Austen when he was at Platform One, and I was at the Air Force Research Lab at the time. So when it came time for me to transition, he managed to pull off pulling me over to Platform One. So I've been at Platform One for about 3 years now. If you're not familiar with us, we have a number of offerings that are related to open source, and so we run a thing called Iron Bank, which is a distribution point for open source software and commercial software in general, and then we have some open source products out there in the world as well. We've got about 9 more months at Platform One, and they'll be moving on to Kessel Run. So Kessel Run is another one of those big software organizations in the Air Force that's trying to move the Air Force off of its old mindset of treating software like it's a fighter jet and buying one version every 10 years or 20 years or something like that.
All right, so why are we here? Ultimately, goal is to first learn about how the government talks about software. We use a lot of, well, I'm not part of the government anymore, but I help work with the government still. They use a lot of words that don't make sense, a lot of acronyms, if you've lived that life. So first is just understanding the vernacular and going through some of the policy at a very high level. Then Cameron and I are going to share some success stories. I think it's always better to learn at these talks through practical application and not theory. So we're going to talk about some things that we have done that were good ideas and some that were bad ideas. And then ultimately, I think some of the keynotes were great this morning too, because I think at the end of the day, these talks are really about building community and participating, which requires like active participation, like show up to the community events, get to meet people, have conversations, have happy hour drinks, but like that's how real work still happens. I think sometimes in the remote and asynchronous world that a lot of us live in post-COVID, we think that like everything can be automated or done through Slack messages or GitHub, but it's still people talking to people and relationships that drive everything forward. So just trying to increase some collaboration here. Okay, so this first one, what you see on the right is a policy memo, which the government really likes to push out memos. A very old school way to communicate, but if you read them, it's pretty helpful because it kind of lays out a roadmap for what they're thinking about and the challenges that they're facing. So if you can, fight your way through all the boring stuff, there is good information in them. Or now you can just load them to ChatGPT and ask it questions like it can talk back to you, which is kind of nice. But the first thing you meet in government using open source software is like, I'm not kidding when 50% of the people in government will be like, oh, we don't use open source. It's not allowed. It's too scary. It's in the open. People will, inject malicious code.
You could have foreign contributors.
Exactly. And so, but what you realize though, and some of the statistics were shared in the keynote this morning too. I think the number they showed was 86%. This one talked 90%. Still close enough. Every software project has open source in it, right? So it's not actually a question. Like it's not even a question worth asking. You just jump straight to the conclusion that you are. And so that's where you got to start from. The second part is realizing, and I struggled with this a lot when I was in government, is like every part of software has to be supported by somebody. Open source, maybe that's community, but a lot of times it's still a company, and you need support because if you're running a system that's doing missile warning for the nation or processing nuclear code, you can't really have it down and have nobody to call to help you. And I think sometimes there's this assumption in the government too that open source means it's free, like free forever. But it's more like free in the sense of liberty, not cost a lot of times. And I think people get that confused, and my own company that I work at now with a lot of smart open source people have taught me that. Jumping a little bit into the specifics of the memo, and I think there's really two types of things you have to think through when using open source in the government. The first is what I call business risk, and the other one's more mission risk. On the business side, you really need to be able to understand licensing. There's lawyers who do nothing but think about licensing, especially in the open source world. I have a little bit more information on that on the next chart. Diversity in maintainers. There's a big difference between code being open and it being open governed by a group of people that have different initiatives and objectives. Because when it's not that way, people can change their mind later, especially if their company gets into survival mode. You might see them change their licensing and business model. The third one is activity. This one's really, really important in the government space, specifically dependency management. They like to scan their software bill of materials. That's a whole issue too, but then they populate this list of common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVEs. And a lot of those come from dependencies, so how active the repo is matters. And then, like I mentioned before, relationships. I used to just think that if you had the competency, you could just ship PRs to projects and they would get merged. That's not really how I've seen it work in practice. You have to have relationships with people. You have to have showed up and put in the time and energy to actually get things upstream. So the other one, which Camden's going to dive way more into now because he's still active duty and has more relevant information than me, is the two threats that they called out in the memo in particular are malicious code and disclosing innovations, which are real concerns. But the malicious code one to me is always interesting because you can actually look through everything in open source and you can evaluate it yourself. When you buy closed source software, you literally have no idea. I think the government usually is just like, great, it's a US-based company, trust, which is not a great way to do things. And open source, as I've learned as well, top talent in the world does not just come from the United States. In fact, I would say it's less comes from the United States than Eastern Europe and all sorts of other places, but some of those countries make the United States government nervous. And sometimes for good reason. And then last one is disclosing innovation, right? Just like a business tries to stay ahead of their market, so does the US government with its adversaries or other governments they're in competition with, and they don't want to give away key innovations and put it out there. And so you really have to think through what can be open and what needs to be not open. This was actually shared in the keynote too. Everybody loves to put this in their presentation. So selfishly, I'm the only one who uses it right because I'm from Nebraska. I was only 15 in 2003 though, so I was not that maintainer, but I am from Nebraska and I love this specific little comic. Getting into some of the specifics before I pass over to Camden, licensing models you typically see of open source software, Apache 2.0, AGPL, but there's BSL, copyleft, and a bunch of other ones that I don't understand. I've only dove into the ones that have become relevant to me in my job every day, but if you've never looked at the license file of the open source repo you're using, I would recommend you start there because that's a good place to figure out what's going on. I already mentioned diversity maintainers. I will say, there's this interesting thing in government too that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. I'd be interested in Camden's take on the other side of the fence, but they like to say that the government owns baselines sometimes, which is funny to me because it's just a collection of like Linux Foundation donated projects to a nonprofit, and like we've donated a project to OpenSSF, so we know what that's like. But the government doesn't own those things, right? They don't maintain them. They don't even have anybody staffed on their maintenance team probably. So you really have to understand like who are the maintainers, what companies they come from, what are your relations with them, and sometimes, surprise, surprise, it's worth paying them directly to make changes to support you as well. We already talked about activity. You have to understand release cycles, especially because you're building off of these things, and if their roadmap takes a turn that doesn't go the same direction as yours, you have a massive dependency issue that can cause you a lot of time and money. And I talked about dependency management. That's mostly related to CVEs in the government's eyes. That's like the outcome they're looking for. And then, yeah, the relationship management, the chop wood, carry water concept really comes into play, right? If you actually want to impact some of these bigger projects, you have to be actively engaged in the community. You have to show up to events. You have to show up to virtual calls. You actually have to talk to people about maybe their lives and not just software all the time too, and figure out who they are and what they're up to. But that's the real way you actually manage your supply chain is more through relationships, in my opinion.
Yeah, so one of those two risks that is explicitly called out in the memo is this risk of malicious code. Like Austen said, I think that there's a good argument to be made that when it comes to open source software, at least you can inspect it. I've run into a couple of people that tell me they do inspect all their open source dependencies. I think they have very tiny projects where they don't understand what that means. So there's definitely a perception that it's scarier to be using code that everyone can see or that people that you don't know have written or something like that. So one of the ways, as a matter of policy and a matter of practice that we're working on understanding what software it is we're consuming is through software bills of materials. I have a bit of a personal pet peeve here in my sub-bullet where there's a lot of discussion about thou shalt have an SBOM. The government will require that commercial software vendors provide SBOMs, and agencies will collect and store SBOMs as records and things like this. I don't find a lot of wording in any of those policies around, what is the accuracy of the SBOM? There is language around standardization, but we're not talking about accuracy or completeness or things like that. We're just kind of assuming that the ecosystem is good enough. But today at Iron Bank, we are generating and storing and signing and distributing SBOMs and working with the rest of the community to try to get better at that. Where the rubber really meets the road on that, I would say, is when it comes to vulnerability scanning. And so once you can enumerate all or a good chunk of your dependencies, everything that you know about, you can then start comparing them to the CVE database and things like that. So there's this idea sometimes that we all need to get to 0 CVEs or something like that. When you're working with other external projects, that's not always going to be possible. So if someone hands you a precompiled piece of commercial software that's not open source, and you find a dependency and you think it has a vulnerability in it, you don't have the ability to go patch that, right? And so even though that dependency itself is probably an open source project. And so we do a lot of work around trying to assess which ones of these matter, which ones don't. That's work that's valuable. It's kind of grunt work, but it has to be done. But we're trying to centralize it so that it only happens one place, right? So we can adjudicate, for example, that the CVE from a library is not actually exploitable in a given context. You don't need to decide that at every organization across the federal government, hopefully. We can decide it once and then distribute that information around. I think the other thing that makes this difficult when it comes to malicious code or dangerous code or anything like that is that the context matters a lot. And so, what is your runtime configuration? What's your data that's going in there? We have a lot of stuff in the DoD that is not internet connected, and the attack path looks a little bit different, right? We're not allowing arbitrary signups from arbitrary users. Not everyone gets to shove data in, things like that. So I think two really interesting places that we're going, across the federal government is how do we actually extend the chain of trust outside of government? So, we spent a lot of time over the last few decades sometimes building systems internal to government where we can sign objects, where we can say that there's only an information path from one place to another place, from one repository to another. That doesn't scale with open source. We need to be able to distribute that out around the whole world. We can't just run everything inside of our own systems. And then probably the most difficult part of all this is that risk management is inherently subjective. And so one thing that open source memo that was on the previous page talks about is your mission needs to make the determination based on what risk they can accept, both the risk of not using something and building it from scratch, because that's going to slow you down, or the risk of actually utilizing it. This one here, this is a particular pain point for me. So there's this idea that every algorithm that we use inside the DoD is probably proprietary. I think if we've learned anything over the last couple of years of seeing these gigantic AI models come out, it's that the government is probably not going to be the one developing the cutting edge algorithm. We're going to be consumers of algorithms. And so, interestingly enough, we're actually required to release some software, like by law, by policy. It was part of the NDAA that said we have to be, contributing a good chunk of our code to the open source community. But at the same time, we're not allowed to disclose anything that's considered critical technology. So kind of for a number of years, it was actually difficult to even wrap our heads around inside the DoD the concept of how we would interact with the open source community. So this memo really helped because it says that explicitly that DoD employees, including service members, can contribute, and they can do it as part of their actual day job. It doesn't have to be something they do at night. That also means that, where appropriate, we can actually acknowledge that we're doing this work, we're opening issues or submitting patches or something on behalf of a government program, and instead of just being me, Camden, on the weekend. The memo also says that we actually have to contribute our improvements upstream, and that we are not supposed to fork projects and then withhold our contributions until the end of time. Believe it or not, if you're used to working in a DoD-specific ecosystem, the first instinct in a lot of these systems is actually just to, well, let me fork it, and then I'll make my changes, and I won't show anyone else, because that's going to protect my interests as the DoD. So it's really nice to have kind of a piece of policy that says, don't do that. Obviously, the maintenance burden that comes with that is just terrible. So a few years ago, I had my first attempt to open source a project. So it was a desktop application, and it had been in active development for, at this time, probably 10 or 15 years. The program was shutting down due to a lack of funding, but we still had a whole bunch of users. And this was an application that was developed, or that was distributed on the open internet. It was used by a bunch of people all around the federal government, even though it was DoD developed. It was actually used, by private industry a whole lot as well. Just kind of a helpful little piece of software. But the funding stream for it dried up. So as part of shutting down that contract, I got a delivery of source code. And my first delivery was nothing but source code. No build instructions, no build environment, no scripts, no tests, just raw source code. So I went back and I said, hey, I need more than this. So I eventually got the developer imaged his laptop and sent me the image. Needless to say, I was not able to actually open source this thing. So interestingly enough, it was old enough that when I got a hold of the source code, I was like, wait, I thought you had given me I thought you told me that you sent me all of your revisions. I thought I had the history. It's like, oh yeah, I'll send you the history. Well, it wasn't in Git, it was still in Subversion. So I kept asking Git what was going on, and it had no idea. So the real problem here was, well, there were a lot of problems with trying to open source this, but there was a lot of site-specific configuration that was baked directly into the source code files. So the configuration wasn't stored separately. The tests had all sorts of site-specific configuration in them and stuff. So the only way that I ever could have open sourced this would have been to just release a snapshot in time with a whole bunch of stuff deleted and no tests. And I think that we know that never would have been picked up by the open source community. No one would have been able to maintain it and patch that. So I kind of walked away from that with realizing that trying to open source something after the fact, at best you can kind of just release something into the ether that people can have as a reference, but you're never going to be able to build a project that other people can continue to iterate on if you try to do it after the fact. And so when we're building these things, we have to think about what is the governance model, what is the contribution model, which parts of this do I need to protect in order to protect the government's interests, and which parts of this can be done in public. We have to think about that at the beginning of the project and while it's ongoing, and not at the end as part of some project closeout.
I also failed at delivering software, and I didn't want Camden to be alone. So we're over halfway through. Who's used Slack before in their life? Okay, who's used Mattermost? Oh, surprising amount. Okay, Rocket Chat? All right, sweet. I was checking because in 2018, I was helping United States Cyber Command stand up a secure chat app, and we decided to fork Rocket Chat and do it ourselves. Why did we do that? I don't know. I thought it was a good idea at the time, like Camden said. I thought it would be too much work to try to upstream the changes we needed to deliver that securely in an on-prem environment rather than run something that was, made for SaaS, basically, or run in the cloud. Needless to say, a team of about 6 probably spent 18 months toiling away trying to do that on a forked version of Rocket Chat, only to find out that that was a awful, awful, awful idea.
It works maybe until one release comes out from upstream.
I'll share good. We'll contrast this with good stories next.
Okay, so this is actually 3 different stories on one slide. So these are all stories from other parts of my career. And so in this first one, I was working, not a program that I was on, but a program that was talking to me. They found an incompatibility between something running in their environment and an open source component. They really needed both, like the architecture didn't work without them. And the commercial vendor for their closed source product was not interested in making changes at all. So they came to me and said, hey, we need your help. They couldn't really go work publicly with the upstream open source project because this program didn't want to identify themselves as being a consumer of that for operational security purposes. They also just didn't know how to do that. Like the difference between a contributor and a maintainer and what being a developer meant, they didn't understand any of this. They just knew they were consumers of software. But it turns out that at Platform One, I actually had a way to have a contractual relationship with some of the open source maintainers of that project. So I worked with them. So it was really difficult because I also didn't have log files because those were deemed a little too sensitive to share even with me. So we managed to troubleshoot this thing with no log files and just kind of some general descriptions of what was going on. We got it fixed in the open source software. And then for a handful of months, that program actually carried a patch against that software that the Platform One helped provide them the pre-built component so that it worked in their environment. But then because I had a relationship with the maintainers, we pushed that patch back upstream. And so now we no longer have to carry from now until 20, 30, 40 years when that program sunsets, right? We've used things for a long time in the DoD. We never have to deal with that again because it's in there as part of the upstream and it's part of their test and release process. So it's just normalized as being something that works with it. So in that case, no one from the government was writing code. We were not maintaining the software. We were kind of helping out file a bug report. That was it. But we were able to work with the community and get it patched because we worked with their process. Sometimes the process can be a little bit more direct. So I mentioned Iron Bank. It's sort of like Docker Hub for the DoD, but we distributed around 1,600 different container images that get rebuilt every night. I was playing around with some software tools that scan container images and found one that looked like a pretty cool tool, but it just panicked every time I fed it an Iron Bank container. So I don't know any Go, but I know panics were not good because it didn't work. So I opened up an issue on GitHub, worked with the actual maintainer up there, and through some collaboration and some dialogue, they patched the problem and now it works. So again, it was nice that I didn't have to think about, hey, am I allowed to attribute myself as being part of the Air Force or part of the DoD when I do this? I didn't write any code for that one, but it's more compatible now. And then while I was working on my degree for the Air Force, so getting paid to go to school, played with a whole bunch of different projects and actually had some pull requests that were accepted on GitHub. At the time, basically the prevailing theory was that I could do that because I was in school, and as soon as I graduated, I'd never be able to interact with open source again. So it's nice to know that didn't come true.
All right, this is actually something that I've been a part of the last 2.5 years that I'm really proud of, and if you have any role in making money around open source, this is the part to listen to. Believe it or not, the government will actually fund research and development and prototyping, and they're even willing to do it for open source projects that are fully open and donated to now Linux Foundation. So there's this project from Defense Unicorns called ZARF. It's now part of OpenSSF. It's an air gap package and deployment tool is probably the best way I can describe it. Some of the maintainers are in the room and maybe shaking their head angrily at me if I'm not doing a good job describing it. But the military had a compelling need. They needed to deploy software to submarines. In this specific case is where this journey started. We used to joke that things were air gapped in the government, but now we joke that they're water gapped and space gapped and wherever other gaps you want to invent and use the word. But it does mean your software runs fundamentally different than it did when it was created on the internet, on the cloud. And so we submitted what's called a Small Business Innovative Research Contract, called a SIBR, because they like acronyms. But the government it's effectively a grant over 3 phases. The first one's 6 months, $50K. The second one's 18 months, $1.25 million-ish. They change from year to year depending on how the presidential budget's going. And then phase 3 is actually unlimited. Programs can just continually buy that from you directly without openly competing, because if you've ever worked with the government, the biggest challenge is submitting to these giant proposals that are all like written in a different language. If you're just a normal human, you can't speak proposal. You get sole source justification from this. That's the cool thing about it, is it lets you have unlimited data rights to your things. And it's done that way to protect people and stimulate the economy, right? But what we did is we built, through this multiple phases of an SBIR contract, we built this project completely in the open. And so if you're asking yourself, well, like, why does that really matter? For me personally, one of my biggest frustrations being inside the machine for 12 years is that the government is awful at sharing information. They pay the same companies to build the same thing, and none of them talk to each other, and everybody sitting in this room pays taxes to somebody, and your life is impacted by government services. It might not be defense, but it's definitely healthcare and finance and energy. And so you should all care about that, right? And I think what we showed is we can build something in the open. And I'll give an example, right? I think it was 2 months ago, somebody on LinkedIn from NATO hits me up. They're like, hey, we're having a challenge with Zarf. Can you hop on a call? And I was like, I didn't know you were using Zarf, but I would love that. And we had no, like, we weren't there to make money. We just nerded out for 2 hours with people halfway across the world talking about Zarf for air gap deployments for NATO. But the whole point was a government program manager believed in this enough to take this bet, and now there's people benefiting all over the community. We're not making an extra dime. We don't need to make an extra dime, right? That's not why we did it. We did it because this is stuff that should be built in the open and shared. So I wanted to share that example because there is success stories out there of these things happening. We're not the only company that's done this either. There's others that have. But it is a really cool way to kind of have industry and government and the open source community, kind of all 3 pieces playing together in one space, which is not always easy to do. We just wanted to wrap up, like, hey, what did we say? Because in the Air Force, and we're both, well, he's still an officer, but like they tell you, say what you're going to say and then say what you said, because that's like how people learn. But I did want to hit a couple things, right? Like, user empathy is a really big deal. Like, if you're trying to build anything with people, if I could tell people anything, like, make sure you actually talk to them first and learn to speak their languages, understand their risks, understand their compliance and requirements. I promise they're not there for made up reasons, even though it feels like it, but if you don't know those things before you build something, you're gonna self-eliminate. Security has to be planned for up front. I don't think Camden went through all the acronyms, but things like FIPS and STIGs, there's a NIST 800-53. We could go, there's people in this room that I'm sure could love to talk about that for a long time, but you have to understand these things to a degree and have somebody on your team who does. And then I selfishly, because I've become more of a product person and I haven't written software for a decade now, I think product mindset is a big deal. Like, you have to know what you're gonna disclose and not disclose from the beginning, because if you don't have a viable solution, you're not gonna be able to pay developers to build open source tools. And it's an interesting give and take to go into that model, but you have to find some sort of common ground where both things are met.
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything that Austen just said there. I think on the consumption side, if you're a government program and you want to go down the journey of consuming open source intentionally, as opposed to just because your prime vendor happened to include it in whatever they shipped you, I think you really do have to think through about how you're going to consume that open source. Like we talked about earlier, everything has to be supported. That support can be commercial, that support can be organic, it can be some mix of the two. But if you are existing within a change control process that doesn't allow you to push more than one change to the system every 6 months, then you're probably not going to want to run nightly builds, right? Because whichever one you grab, you're going to have to live with for 6 months. On the other hand, if you've got a security team that wants to see the latest version of patches running, and they don't care that something isn't actually vulnerable, they just don't like seeing the CVE numbers in there, then you probably want to go with something that is a little closer to a nightly build, or something that is a little more bleeding edge. And so it really depends on your team and what you're capable of doing. If you have to go through flight worthiness before you can deploy it, like, again, probably want to go a little bit slower. You want to, if it takes you 6 months to deploy a product and they have a 6-week release cadence, and so by the time you deploy it, it's like, I don't know, that's like 4.5 months out of date, that's probably not going to go well for you, and it's going to cause you problems. As far as interacting with the open source community and with software at large, hiring the right people, hiring people that already have open source experience, it really matters. If I could, I would hire people with actual experience maintaining open source projects, like as maintainers. When we talk about owning things in the government, whether it's a baseline or a project or something like that, that means something fundamentally different to someone who's been, in the Air Force for 16 years versus someone that's working in an open community. I don't know how many times I've seen incredibly well-intentioned people do something like email a PDF to a maintainer asking them to please annotate all places in your software where you are accepting the risk of a downstream dependency. And it's like, wait, I don't even know what language you're speaking, and why is your PDF so bad? So getting the right people is hard, but it really matters. And then, this last one, don't be afraid to participate. Don't be a jerk about it, right? But in my experience, maintainers and contributors, they do want to know how people are using their software. They do want to know how it could be better. No, they don't care that it doesn't work with your 15-year-old LDAP implementation, but they'll say, yeah, that's why we don't do that anymore. But don't be afraid to get out there in the world. I think building in public is part of this too. I don't know why it is, but we have this idea inside the DoD at least, I don't know if it's throughout the entire federal government, that you need to work on projects in private until they're good enough to release. And then, once we finish it, we're going to open source it. We'll take a pause and we'll put it through PA review, and then 6 months later, we'll open source it, and then, everyone's going to come and build it with us after it's done. No one's going to work with you after it's done. That sounds incredibly boring. So building in the open, I think, is a huge part of that, too.
All right, and on that note of participating, you can find Camden and I's LinkedIn up here if you want to stalk us. But more importantly, I'll be at the ZARF booth from 4 to 6 today if anybody wants to chat with me. We got Defense Unicorns people there all day. But really just want to say thank you to people as well. I think the community collaboration and participation stuff is great. And we've been a part of CNCF for a while too, but seeing OpenSSF become its own thing and talk about security specifically, for us serving the federal government, we can't deliver anything that doesn't take security seriously, so having a community to have this conversation is really important, and that's why there's a lot of us here to chat about it, so really do appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely connect. There's a lot of hard problems to solve in this space, and if we all try to solve all of them independently, we'll get 1% of 100 different solutions, and it'd be great to get something more like 60% of one. So definitely reach out. Thank you.